Today, we'll discuss the cases of 3 psychotic doctors who were hell-bent on taking lives. Christopher Dunstsch performed surgeries while on LSD. Then we have Britain's most famous serial killer, Linda Hazzard, who killed by starving people. Then, the angel of death, Harold Shipman, who took over 250 lives in his career.
They thought they had a young, hot neurosurgeon with cutting-edge skills and excellent training.
But instead of helping patients, he hurts them badly.
I mean, it was the worst. I mean, I'd never seen anything like it.
Known to the world as Dr. D, with the D standing for death, Christopher Duntsch has been known to give the medical profession a terrible reputation with his malpractice. Working as a neurosurgeon in Dallas-Fort Worth, Duntsch was single-handedly responsible for the death of 2 patients, not to mention all the patients who had to cut off their body parts because of his bad decisions. But were these incidents just accidents, or was there something else at play here? Born in Memphis, Tennessee, Christopher wasn't the first member of his family to enter the medical profession. His father, Donald, was a physical therapist who inspired Christopher to pursue medicine. At the beginning of his career, everything was great. Dunsh was a capable neurosurgeon. However, all of that came crashing down sometime between 2006 and 2007, when the doctors started developing a drug addiction. His friends noticed that he would stay up multiple nights in a row, overdosing on prescription painkillers. Slowly, his addiction turned him towards drugs like LSD and cocaine. And, crazy as it is to believe, he would also often perform surgeries while he was under the influence of all of these substances, constantly putting vulnerable lives at risk with his ways. And despite his obvious drug problem, he somehow managed to earn surgical rights at the Baylor Regional Medical Center, which is where the real story starts. They say that with a lot of power comes a lot of responsibility, and in this situation, Christopher was responsible for the lives of his patients.
What was going through my head at that time was, what did he do to me?
It makes you kind of emotional when you have your life kind of destroyed by something like this.
Ken Fennell did not expect to be spending his golden years in a motorized wheelchair.
The dreams you had before, you realize you can't do anymore.
During the 2 years that he spent at Baylor Regional, Christopher played with around 38 lives. Starting off with his first ever victim, Kenneth Fennell, who had to go through a simple operation. But because Dunsh ended up operating on the wrong part of his back, the patient experienced an extreme amount of pain that required yet another surgery. He was left paralyzed for life once Dunsh was done with him.
He could fix me where nobody else could.
But when that surgery didn't work, Fennell allowed Dunsh to operate again.
That's when he did the damage. And I woke up a day and a half later in intensive care on a morphine drip, and from my waist down, it felt like there was a bonfire burning on me.
And while this should have been alarming enough for the medical board, somehow with his over-the-top confidence, Christopher was able to lure in one patient after the other, making them believe that he was the most skilled surgeon they could choose at the hospital. According to Mark Hoyle, a surgeon who had been on one of the multiple surgeries that Dunsh had messed up during his career, Christopher was arrogant and believed that everyone but him was always in the wrong.
You moved here from, was it Tennessee, is that right?
Correct.
Okay, so you just started, you did all your schooling there and then you came?
Yeah, med school, PhD, graduate school, residency, fellowship in spine. Hi Dad, this is Christopher. I was supposed to go home tonight, as you know, and I'm not now. Unexpectedly, the police came and picked me up regarding the DA issues that I mentioned to you.
This way, the surgeon fooled everyone into letting him perform surgeries again and again and again. Another one of his patients who had to go through a lot because of Christopher's negligence was Jerry Summers, who was actually a close friend to him. Just like before, Jerry's procedure had to be fairly simple. 2 of his neck vertebrae had to fuse, and so he was going under the knife for spinal fusion surgery, performed by none other than Dunsh, who he treated as a friend. But staying true to his ways, Dunsh showed up to the OR stoned out of his mind, and ended up constricting the spinal cord, making his patient lose 112,000 milliliters of blood. And while the right thing to do would have been to go back and do a revision surgery, he refused to do it. What's worse is that Summers had to live his entire life paralyzed from the neck down, feeling all the pain but being unable to move. He eventually passed away in 2021 because of all of the complications and infections his body had to endure as a result of Dunsch's negligence. This caused Christopher to temporarily lose his surgical rights, but once the suspension was lifted, his comeback wasn't all that great. His first surgery after Summers was on 55-year-old Kelly Martin, who was the doctor's first casualty after bleeding out in the ICU when all she was admitted for was a routine procedure that any other surgeon could have done with their eyes closed. To this day, no one really knows whether Dunsch truly believed that these botched procedures were his mistakes. And even if he did, he never let anyone else catch on for the longest time.
I wake up from surgery and I knew something was wrong. I couldn't feel my feet. I could not move my left arm. I couldn't talk. I was in more pain than I ever thought imaginable. And my wife walked over and she was crying. My wife told me that they had encountered a tumor during surgery and it started bleeding so bad that they had to abort the surgery.
It took almost 4 hours to get it to quit bleeding. They had to be cauterized and he did a biopsy and then proceeded to ask if Jeff had any cancer that ran in his family, making me believe, oh my gosh, my husband has cancer.
To stop all of the attention from coming his way, Dunsch ended up resigning from Baylor and attempted to do all the damage control he could. Why? Well, because he wanted to make sure that the other hospitals would want him on board. And while the Dallas Medical Center almost immediately brought him in as a surgeon, when he went on to continue his streak of life-taking procedures and drug addiction.
After this surgery began, I started getting the impression that Dr. Dunn didn't really know what he was doing. Everyone involved in that case, from the scrub techs to the x-ray tech to myself to the anesthesiologist, gave each other looks many times during that case because we just didn't understand what he was doing. Tragically, what happened in the end is Florella Brown died less than 24 hours after her surgery.
However, before the end of his first week at the new hospital, Dunsch had messed up on 2 different surgeries, causing the hospital to fire him immediately. After he had amputated a patient's nerve and sliced the other's vertebral artery, Dunsch's malpractice was finally brought to light. And while he did manage to find a few short-term jobs, his license was eventually revoked once an investigation was launched into all of the patients whose lives he had endangered during the most simple of procedures. Dunsch lost all his surgical privileges when 2 physicians who had seen him work complained to the Texas Medical Board in an attempt to stop Dr. Death's murder spree. One of the doctors called Dunsch a sociopath, demanding for his license to be revoked.
He was convicted in 2017 and sentenced to life in prison.
The whole case took a year to process, and during this time, Dr. D kept on practicing, putting the lives of even more patients at risk, which was sadly a failure of the medical system at large.
First at 6, an historic verdict. The doctor convicted of intentionally botching a woman's surgery will spend the rest of his life in prison.
I'm just so grateful from the bottom of my heart. This will not bring my mother back, but it is some sense of justice for all of the families, for all of the victims.
2 years later, Dunsch was found guilty of 5 counts of aggravated assault and 1 count of harming an elderly person who was one of his patients. The criminal was sentenced to life in prison in 2017, bringing an end to his unhinged behavior that was putting other people's lives at risk. Currently, Christopher is incarcerated at the OB's Ellis Unit of Texas Department of Criminal Justice in Huntsville and is not eligible for parole until 2045. To think that all of this could have been stopped if his license had been revoked the very first time he made a patient suffer. But alas, the charismatic nature of doctors makes them really easy to trust. And if you thought this case was bad, just wait till the next one.
Everybody thought the world of him. He was grooming the community in order to kill them. If you want to become a serial killer, become a doctor, because nobody will stop you, and nobody did.
History has seen some pretty great love stories. But none of them have been as intense as the one between Harold and Primrose Shipman, who were accomplices. But before we get into that, who was Harold Shipman? Let's throw it back to 1970 when Shipman graduated from the Leeds School of Medicine and started working as a physician.
Shipman spent his early years caring for his cancer-stricken mother. He attended medical school, married, had 4 children, and a drug problem that almost cost him his practice.
In the span of 2 decades, he killed over 215 people by injecting them with lethal doses of painkillers and weird medicinal cocktails. But why did he do all of this? Harold had a complicated childhood. He loved his mother, who would sing praises of him that resulted in Harold developing quite the superiority complex as a young child. So when his mother was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, it wasn't easy on him. He would spend his entire days taking care of his mother, and in doing so, he was introduced to morphine. Even at an early age, he was fascinated with how the drug sent his mother into a calm, zen state. And this is what inspired him to take up medicine as a career. And while he failed his first entrance exam, Harold kept at it and finally joined a medical practice in Yorkshire, which is where he himself got addicted to painkillers. By 1974, Harold met Primrose and married her when she was just 17 years old and Harold 19. The couple even gave birth to 2 beautiful children together. But sadly, that wasn't enough to bring this corrupted doctor's life back on track. Harold would go to work and forge drug prescriptions to satisfy his own addictions. He would hoard painkillers everywhere he went, taking them every chance he got. Eventually, the hospital management caught on to him, and he was fired immediately.
It started with a keen young man coming with the latest ideas and techniques, with a great deal of enthusiasm and very much hands-on, putting it into practice and encouraging us all to do the same thing. And I think we all benefited. He had 1 or 2 blackouts and was finally diagnosed by a consultant as having epilepsy and being unable to drive a car. So his wife volunteered to fill in this so that he could continue to work, which he did very efficiently.
But Fred Shipman hadn't told his colleagues the truth. He was a drug addict with a huge dependency on pethidine, a painkiller used in childbirth.
Harold's colleagues also got him admitted into a drug rehab program where he could get all the help he needed. After spending some years there, Shipman was allowed to practice medicine once again, and he joined the Donnybrook Medical Center. Harold was quick to earn everyone's trust there, and while some people thought he came off as arrogant, most thought that he was just pretty good at his job. But was he?
He immediately said, "I'm afraid I'm a pethidine addict, and if you will just stand by me and cover me, I will get off it and all will be well."
Shipman's unspeakable crimes came to light when the hospital undertaker noticed that the patients under his care were dying at an alarmingly high rate. What's creepier is that they all seemed to die in the same kind of position, and that common pattern was something that had never been observed at the hospital before. Sadly though, the undertaker ended up talking to Shipman about it, who shut the entire thing down before it could erupt and get out of hand. However, his other colleagues had also started noticing the pattern. After an inquiry was launched, Harold was found to be innocent. Why? Well, because he knew how to cover up his crimes, and for some strange reason the hospital never looked into his past records, because if they had, they would have found the reason why this doctor was fired from his last job. What this entire situation did was make Shipman all the more careful about covering his tracks. He started altering his patients' medical records to shift the blame away from him and make it look like they had died of natural causes other than drug overdoses. And because he had the perfect family to show off to the public, he restored his image as a loving family man who did all he could in his power. But his entire act was exposed when Angela Woodruff, the daughter of one of his ill-fated patients, refused to let him off the the hook for her mother's death. Angela's mother, Kathleen, was found dead in her home in June 1998, right after she had gone to see Dr. Shipman. And while the doctor tried to do all he could to make sure that an autopsy wasn't done, Woodruff insisted on it, especially after finding out that her mother had left a huge part of her estate to the doctor for some strange reason. Being a lawyer, Angela immediately knew that the document had been forged and she had her mother's body exhumed, which instantly revealed that she had died of a morphine overdose, all evidence pointing towards the doctor.
His lawyer to pose for a photo to show he had nothing to hide. But what Shipman couldn't disguise was his contempt for those who dared to question him.
Straight away, if you look at his brows, they're raised in the middle. This is very hard to do. And when the brows are raised, this is a reliable signal of distress.
After this, the police raided Shipman's home and found old medical records and the typewriter that he had used to write the document that transferred Kathleen's estate to him. The police arrested Shipman at once, launching an investigation into all of the patients who had passed away under his care. It was then revealed that the fraudulent doctor had asked most of his patients' families to get cremated so that he would never have the crimes traced back to him. After that, he would create fake medical notes right after killing his patients to make sure that the creation of his notes and the death of the patient coincided perfectly. So it's pretty obvious that all of his murders were carefully planned to a T. After the investigations kicked off, the prosecution came to the conclusion that Shipman had killed over 15 patients, with the reason being he needed to experience a power trip where he felt like he could control life or death. The murderer, in turn, claimed that he had committed his crimes out of compassion, putting an end to his patients' suffering. But since none of his patients were terminal, the claims were baseless. As far as Kathleen is concerned, the investigators also found that her alleged will did not contain any of her fingerprints, further proving that it was forged. What's more is that the patients' families also reported the doctor calling emergency services for help once people started dying. But the telephone records showed that he never made any calls to anyone and was instead letting the patients die after injecting them with deadly doses of morphine. With all of this coming to light, his drug stash was also uncovered, bringing the case to a very obvious close. As far as the doctor himself was concerned, he remained arrogant and acted like he was above the whole thing. Despite all the evidence against him, he maintained his innocence, saying that no one had ever really witnessed him killing someone, so all the charges were pointless. What's more is that his wife Primrose stood by him like no other. She continuously defended her husband and refused to comply with the authorities to bring justice to his victims. When she was made to take the stand, she refused to reveal any information, and the jury believed that she herself had been abused by Shipman her whole life, which explains why she was so scared of him even when he was being put behind bars. Thankfully, though, the jury found him guilty on the 15 counts of murder and 1 of forgery. In 2000, he received 15 life sentences without the possibility of any parole. 4 years after he was sent to prison, he was found hanging from the window bars of his prison cell. And while that was the end of his story, the impact of his violence and brutality he had on the entire medical community is still felt to this day, much like the next case, which was one of the earliest and most insane documented cases of malpractice. Known to be Washington's first ever female serial killer, Linda Hazzard has been one of the greatest scammers to have ever lived. With no actual medical degree, Linda convinced the medical board in Washington to give her a license that allowed her to practice medicine back in the 19th century. And well, let's just say the rules were a little lax then. Whatever little Linda knew of medicine and healing, she had learned from Dr. Edward Hooker Dewey, who called himself the pioneer of healing using the process of fasting. After working with him, Linda moved to Washington in 1907, where she then became a practitioner of alternative medicine, with no one to keep a check and balance of what this alternate medicine really was. According to Linda herself, she was a fasting specialist. So anyone who would come to her would be asked to fast for a certain number of days. Why? Well, because Linda believed that every disease in the world occurred as a result of eating too much. So to cure her patients of all their ailments, she kept them in her facility and denied them any food for weeks on end. According to her, this was the best way for them to get rid of harmful toxins from their bodies so they could heal themselves. The only problem was that this fasting was actually just plain old starvation.
In 1902, her first patient named Gertrude Young died under her care of apparent starvation after undergoing a 40-day fast prescribed by Hazzard.
By 1908, at least 2 people had passed away under her care, and when the quack practitioner was questioned, she somehow managed to convince people about her fasting method, even going as far to say that her patients hadn't died because of their starvation. In fact, she went on to claim that the fasting had actually prolonged their lifespans. She went on to use absurd arguments to protect herself, saying that even physicians sometimes lost their patients but were never questioned, so why was she? Hazzard's entire thing was that she wanted people to believe that traditional doctors hated her and were trying to ruin her by spreading these rumors. And well, let's just say that whatever she was doing seemed to be working. Linda's most famous patients were sisters Claire and Dora Williamson, who traveled all the way from England to Seattle after hearing her miraculous fasting method. The 2 sisters were extremely sick and believed that only a natural method could cure them. So despite the families discouraging them, they came to Hazzard, hoping to be cured by her. The 2 women wanted to stay at the doctor's sanitarium, but Hazzard told them that the place wasn't ready, which was pretty strange since it was all over the papers showing the place to have huge gardens, luxurious bedrooms, spas, and whatnot. But of course, that was only one leg of Hazzard's fraud. Anyway, the 2 women rented an apartment in Seattle and started Hazzard's regimen. This meant that they could eat absolutely nothing at all. All the 2 sisters could consume were 2 cups of broth every day. But even that went to waste since the treatment required them to take several long walks every day, go through hour-long enemas and pummeling massages that exhausted them to no end. Within a week, Claire and Dora's bodies had started giving up. Hazzard then moved them into her own home where she continued the inhumane treatment. 16 days into the whole thing, Claire passed away. At the time of her death, she weighed only 50 pounds, and the autopsy showed that her cause of death was nothing but starvation, exposing Hazzard for the fraud she really was. Her entire scam operation came to a halt when Claire and Dora's childhood nurse came to visit them in the USA and was surprised to find Claire dead and Linda bedridden, only weighing 50 pounds. At once, she tried to remove the girl from the quack physician's care, but in a shocking turn of events, Hazzard now had Dora's guardianship. That, and the fact that she had made the authorities believe that Dora was mentally ill to the point where she couldn't take care of herself. Hazzard also claimed that the 2 sisters owed her $2,000 in medical fees, and that Dora wouldn't be allowed to go anywhere before the dues were cleared. But Nurse Margaret wasn't going down without a fight. After seeing Dora completely pale, no color in her cheeks, and with her bones poking out of her body, it was evident that this treatment, or whatever you want to call it, was nothing but a big scam. This launched a full-blown investigation where it was discovered that Linda had killed over a dozen people, and what's surprising is that they had all willingly paid for it. It was then discovered that at the time of her death, Linda also had an excess amount of drugs in her system that had shrunk her internal organs, causing cirrhosis that finally killed her. But till the very end, Linda claimed that her patient had been too far gone already for the treatment to have saved her. What's worse is that Linda's husband Samuel was an accomplice in the murder. Samuel helped Linda transfer Dora's guardianship rights over to her, and together, the couple had also taken over Claire's belongings, including all of her money and jewelry after she passed away. And as far as Dora goes, she was too weak to do anything about it at that point. After this case, people started believing that Linda had some kind of spiritual abilities that made people follow her strange starvation cure. Some also speculated that she used hypnosis and made people starve themselves to death. It wasn't until the sisters' uncle, John Herbert, arrived that things started picking up pace. Herbert ended up giving Linda over $1,000 to take Dora back home, but he didn't stop there. Linda was then tried for Claire's murder, and the investigation revealed that the quack doctor had tricked plenty of other wealthy individuals into trying out her starvation treatment, robbing them of millions of dollars. Some had even gone ahead and signed their properties over to her, and to this day, we don't know if all of this was done willingly. In February 19 1913, Linda Hazzard was sentenced to 20 years in prison for manslaughter. That resulted in a host of her supporters flocking out and protesting for her to be released. But the evidence was far too much to be ignored. However, she was let out 2 years later and returned back to her old ways, calling her patients students this time around because her license had been revoked. Linda's streak of medical malpractice continued into the 1930s and only ended when she died herself. And in a fitting end to her story, the reason behind her death was starvation from a new cure that she was testing out on herself.